This is a transcript for an invited Zoom presentation, which I was invited to give to the Agnostics group of the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I was a bit surprised by the invitation, since I'm neither a religious scholar nor a professional philosopher. Still, the challenge seemed interesting. I thought for a while about humans, how humans actually deal in different ways with their own place in the universe. And a good topic seemed to be why religions are sometimes necessary, and the gods even more so. This is not a live recording of the actual seminar. 43 people logged into the Zoom seminar on the 9th of November, 2024, from spots as scattered as Australia, Thailand, and the United States of America. The presentation took 50 minutes, and this was followed by what turned into another 3.5 hours of questions and my attempted answers. In this recording, I will just scroll the transcript while reading it. Some people may choose to just extract the audio. A PDF of the transcript is also online at my academia.edu repository. I'll put a link below to that. So let's get on with it. Introduction. Well, hello everyone. Thank you, David Miller, for inviting me to drop into your house of controversy. He has plucked me out of the ether for some mysterious reason. I come here with modesty and even fear. I admit to a severe case of imposter syndrome. I gather from David that you have all been arguing with gods and about gods forever, together with their earthly agencies, religions. You have collections of clever arguments and learned quotations at your fingertips. I have little of that. I'll step into puddles and fall down waterfalls that you all know about. Maybe some of you will decide to hate me forever, but the beauty of Zoom is that you can switch off any time. Over here in Adelaide, Australia, I came here because the rent was cheaper after being thrown out of China at the end of 2010. They've decided after 8 years that I'm mad, bad, and dangerous to know, but at least I pay the rent. As for gods, singular or plural, they are harder to shake. But for the sake of argument, I'll entertain a couple of possibilities that we're mostly not talking about much here. Well, okay, that like the cells in a human body, a cosmic body, both a cosmic body and a human body perhaps, we're part of some universal living process, a pantheistic God, if you like. We might create an itch or even an infection, but are unlikely to excite individual attention. B, that our species was captured at an early stage of evolution by a kind of mental parasite, a software bacteria or godbot, which, like many bacteria, has proved to have its uses. Or, being a little more adventurous, C, that we are the playthings for a bunch of delinquent teenage gods hanging out somewhere in a black hole on the other side of the Milky Way galaxy. Anyway, there's not much we can do about it, but often claim as apex predator humans that we can do a lot about it. So this brings us to the interesting subject of human beings. Why do some of us decide that gods are necessary, while others, apparently in increasing numbers, decide that they can happily do without gods? Well, first, a little housekeeping. To keep this meetup manageable, I've selected 10 talking points from an infinite number of possible points. And I'll go through each of the 10 talking points, giving my own, hopefully succinct view on each of them. In stage 2, each of the 10 talking points will be offered up for in a sequence, again, allowing you to express your views or to respond to my suggestions. I expect that David will moderate this stage, or part of it, perhaps. So with David's permission, I will also post on the meetup website for the Agnostics group some reading and viewing of links that I've made use of. For this YouTube version, I'll try to post those links also on the YouTube page. There's nothing special about the links, but they may allow some follow-up. Okay, and just quickly, let me put in a plug for 3 meetups I run from Adelaide, recently transferred to Facebook groups. The first is Adelaide English Conversation Practice. This is designed for people using English as a second language. I taught English as a second language in universities in 7 countries over many years, as well as lecturing linguistics and training teachers. Okay, the second meetup I run is called, more interesting for you perhaps, Active Thinkers for and Against, now run on Zoom every second Tuesday evening. Active Thinkers has been running since 2011, firstly in Brisbane, then in Adelaide. It has become extremely unpopular since it turns out that a vanishingly small number of people interested in any idea, opinion, which is not their own. That's humans for you. Okay, and finally, Adelaide Shallow Thinkers. That's a Friday evening cafe version of Active Thinkers. All right, back to our topic today. Here, I'll just go through the list of talking points and then expand them later. So the first talking point, what is your big picture question? Part A, what's the most interesting and important big picture question in your life? And B, when do you expect to get an answer to that question? This might look a bit obscure here, but it'll become clear in a few minutes. 2, second talking point, why do so many of us no longer depend upon religious stories to tell us who we are? And 3, this is in Australia. I'm in Australia. what are the 38.9% of Australians who say they have no religion? That's the 2021 census. What are they missing out on? 4, a little more complex. What are the benefits of founding a spiritual movement united by a titular God or gods, instead of merely appealing to an ideology, or even more loosely, to a general philosophy, such as humanism? 5, pantheism or a personal God. This turns out to be pretty important for our topic. Number 6, is modern post-industrial society hospitable to theistic or theocratic control? And we'll look at some contemporary examples. And 7, have we really reached an age of enlightenment for the many? Not the few, but for the many. Number 8, the human brain as a prediction machine. Are the rituals and beliefs of religion still necessary stabilizing forces for large populations? Again, that looks a little obscure, but there's some very interesting studies which you'll see the relevance shortly. Number 9, are the rituals and beliefs of religions still necessary stabilizing forces for large populations? And number 10, God as a psychological helper versus God as a scam. All right, so now I'll give you my take on each of these particular talking points. The first one, again, what's your big picture question? What are the most important and interesting what is the most important and interesting big picture question in your life? Secondly, when do you expect to get an answer to that question? Well, back in the 1990s, when the internet was young, there were no blogs, but I had a website. I put 2 form questions on my website, thormay.net. Hardly anybody visits thormay.net nowadays, except apparently the Chinese government, probably to spread content. Anyway, then, however, back in the 1990s, it was quite popular. I was astonished by the very large response to those form questions. I was even more astonished by the uniformity of the answers to the first question. What was the most important and interesting big picture question in your life? The answers were overwhelmingly of the form, why was I born? Why am I here? However, answers to the second question were sparse. When do you expect to get an answer to the first question? Some people, of course, had a religious answer, and those folk are of special interest to us today. The majority had no answer or replied, never. I thought about this big picture question myself. My conclusion, and it's just a personal conclusion, was that if I could never get a reasonable answer to that second question, then probably it was a waste of a short life spending much time on trying to answer, why am I here? Instead, I decided to ask another big general question. How does it work? How does my car work? And I once wrote a book called English for Mechanics. I know how cars work. I can even take an engine apart. How does China work? I worked in the People's Republic of China for 5 years, and I still can't answer that question. I don't think anybody can. How does the human brain work? Well, I walked away from two doctoral dissertations dealing with that kind of thing in linguistics. And very interesting, but I still don't know. I eventually wrote a PhD on something entirely unrelated. There you go. But from that time, I've never been bored. And if you think about it, the scientific industrial revolution has been driven by people like me who stopped worrying too much about why was I born, and instead focused their lives on how does it work. So today's topic is really about the difference between those people interested or insisting on a religious answer to why was I born, why am I here? And those turning to more accessible questions, hopefully accessible questions, such as, how does it work? Okay, so the second talking point, let's see. Why do so many of us no longer depend upon religious stories to tell us who we are? Ethnic groups and even countries are mostly glued together, firstly, I guess, by economic cooperation and an interest in mutual security. Then, B, there's shared experience, and that's important. And finally, C, they're glued together by the stories they tell themselves about who they are, what they stand for, and where they come from. Historically, worldwide, religious stories or myths, and not the street meaning of myth, I mean stories of origin that were passed down generation to generation. Myths were critical to this experience of self-identification. Now, until recently, most populations were illiterate, except for a small elite. So that regular congregation in churches, mosques, temples, and so on was critical to orally pass on stories and practices which defined the group. Now, supposedly, we have mass literacy, mass education, and countless channels of communication to shape us daily. This video is one of those channels, of course. However, a proportion of people still prefer the comfort and coherence of an established religion to set their boundaries and direct their energies. And as an aside, among those who seek to represent us in the nation's parliaments, far more are likely to claim a religious affiliation than those whom they represent, they claim to represent. That's even in Australia. I'll come back to that point later. Now, the world now is awash with stories to tell us who we are. Movements gather around some of those stories, and the internet itself, in particular, has enabled the emergence of such groups. They run the whole spectrum, from amateur scientists to environmental campaigners to anti-aging enthusiasts, maybe I should be one of those, to political cults like America's MAGA. How do you say that? That's even before we factor in more established tribes like those you find in spectator sport and music. Wannabe influencers are legion. Some of them manage to grab a meme and run, attracting, at least for a while, followers who may even be counted in the millions. This happens while the churches, the ones I know about anyway, excepting for some charismatic startups, the churches empty out. An Iranian friend tells me that the mosques in Iran are also emptying out. I find that a bit fascinating. Mixing God and Caesar has always been a fraught move. It comes to a bad end. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Lake, the 99 million members of the Communist Party of China, are they spiritual? Well, they're in the party as a career move, not as a search for identity. I worked in that country for 5 years, and that's one of the few things I'm confident about. It doesn't mean that people in China, by the way, are without belief, spiritual beliefs. I'll come back to that. It's also true that sometimes ancient belief systems are worked over and have always been worked over to fit current social and political needs. Some of you may have played a parlor game, for example, of what would Jesus have said, as you survey some contortions of, well, say, America's religious right, or in Russia, the Putin world remake of the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, they do cater to people, to some people who seem to need that kind of thing. And their God comes along for the ride. But it doesn't have to be overtly religious. For example, the philosophy of Stoicism has been around since 300 years before Christ. And, you know, it's got plenty to recommend it. I've added a link to a video which tracks how Stoicism has been turned inside out and upside down, first as grist to snake oil internet marketing, then as a banner slogan for the so-called manosphere, and finally as a so-called philosophical foundation for America's white supremacy movement. The moral, I guess, is that if you want to bring your wisdom to the world, you might wound up on Truth Social in unexpected ways. Anyway, let's come back to Australia for a moment. Talking point 3. What are the 38.9% of Australians who say they have no religion, the 2021 census, What are they missing out on? Well, like any social or political movement, most religions are a big tent, bringing together an assortment of values and practices, which individually are likely to be found in many communities worldwide, regardless of religion. For example, there's nothing essentially Christian about the biblical 10 Commandments. You know, don't kill, don't steal, and so on. In countries like Australia, large numbers of people are saying that they have no religion. But they are not saying that they have abandoned particular values they may share with religious followers. They're saying that religious institutions no longer add value to what they do and what they believe anyway in their daily lives. Okay, now our fourth talking point. What are the benefits of founding a spiritual movement united by a titular God or gods, instead of merely appealing to an ideology, or even more loosely, to a general philosophy such as humanism? There are probably many answers to this question, depending upon the society in question, its culture, and its stage of historical development. An interesting angle, I think, is taken by a professor called Robin Dunbar. I've linked one of his videos that's entitled "How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures." Dunbar's argument, it wanders around a bit, but his core argument is that religion is about bonding communities, and that it does this naturally, it does this more durably than secular groups. From his research in the settling of North America, the settling, not now, religious groups averaged about 150 members and lasted about 70 years. Comparable secular groups averaged only 50 members and lasted about 10 years. Projecting this into the modern era, human social groups, including villages, real villages, small ones, Facebook and cults, which come and go, average around 150 members in size. So he says that size matters, right? Dunbar also has a longer historical theory. He proposes that from around 8000 BC, with the emergence of farming and villages for protection, not just hunter-gatherer groups, people gathered together, that doctrinal religions were needed to stop people killing each other. They've been in small hunting bands before. This evolved, he says, into what he calls revealed religions from about 3000 BC, with a strict personal God. He links this to a collapse of Sahara ecology. They had their climate change moment too. Invasion of the sea people from Northern Europe, and the destruction of Mediterranean empires. A strict personal God had two effects, Dunbar says: bottom-up bonding as an opiate of the masses, and secondly, as a policeman in the sky, effect to maintain control. Okay, kind of interesting, but having worked for 12 years in China and South Korea, where the whole of East Asia, the spirits still reign supreme, I have deep doubts about parts of Dunbar's thesis. Human psychology is wonderfully devious. There's no doubt, though, that titular gods still have a strong hold on many, many minds. Okay, and this sort of brings us to talking point 5, pantheism. That's an all-encompassing God idea, or a personal God. Many myths and beliefs in traditional societies assume that nature and the universe is a living whole, which must be kept in balance. This balance idea is extremely important. More recent times, some of you may know of James Lovelock's concept of Gaia, and also maybe modern environmentalism tends towards something similar, nature as a living thing, as a whole. This is a kind of pantheism. Well, let's take it a step further in an interior way. You know, current estimates are that a man, women have a few less cells, a man averages about 35 trillion cells. Trillion, 12 zeros, that's a big number. 35 trillion cells. Little animals holding hands. You know, each of those cells has its own little factory. Plus maybe 38 trillion bugs hanging out in the corridors, viruses, bacteria, God knows what. And they all have their own DNA. So it would be easy to see that the idea of a universal pantheistic spirit, you could see that as an extension of the inner universe, which is each of us. You know, we like to think of ourselves as some kind of unity, though philosophers have always questioned that. But yeah, that's what we're made of. So would it be, but you know, humans also want special favors. You know, this thing we call I, you want special favors. So would it be reasonable to see this selfish wish for personal favors as a motivation for declaring a personal helper God or gods who will assist with personal prayers and sacrifices? Okay, well, I've linked a related video by another professor called David Voos, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Well, why belief in God is disappearing in the West. Voos closely links he closely links the fading influence of religion in educated societies with diminishing belief in a personal God. That's personal. Even when some pantheistic notion is accepted. So the proposition he puts is, when God is indifferent to people, people become indifferent to God. I find this fairly persuasive, but that's just my view. Of course, those who do remain attached to recognized religions, including charismatic religions, are usually also welded to the idea of a personal God offering benefits. Right, now, talking point 6, is modern post-industrial society hospitable to theistic control? In the large populations of nation states, there is always a big chunk of those populations which are attracted to some form of absolutist control, even fascism. Witness the recently passed American election. Now, such people, though they are not the only ones, are probably strong candidates for accepting control by the agents of some God. However, the historical and cultural conditions have to be right. Of all of the modalities of human society, the urban industrial and post-industrial variants are perhaps not proving terribly hospitable to theistic tyranny, theocratic government. For one thing, the tendency for democracy itself, with its many messy compromises, that's what democracy is antithetical to unaccountable power. The power of a God, the all-controlling power of a God. But most critically, the whole technological and scientific foundation of modern societies is built upon finding answers to matters which had been considered the province, the business of God and his agents. Moreover, the scientific and technical answers have turned out to be pretty well overwhelmingly more effective and often more congenial than the theistic proscriptions. This is not a comfortable situation for an all-knowing, all-powerful God. Curiously, as I've mentioned before, the old notion of co-nature, balance, the human as nature's warden on a small planet, is much more appealing to men and women in the 21st century. And most so-called New Age religions seem to be heading in that direction. Okay, point 7. Have we really reached an age of enlightenment for the many? Not the few, but the many. The getting of a little competence by the few has left an army of wounded and deformed in its wake. By profession, I'm a teacher, and that's, I'm pretty sure of that. The air around us is shrill with the rhetoric of productivity, efficiency, progress. When these clarion calls to advanced ideology, and they are a kind of ideology, fade into the brutal reality of fixing an engine, of passing an exam, or raising a family, it's not at all clear that many more folk, many more people are smarter, nobler, or more able than their ancestors were 3 generations ago. Electricity, polymers, and futures markets are, for the majority, utterly mysterious miracles of faith. Well, that's my observation. You might disagree. Self-selected rejects from the technical age, and there are a lot of them, flounder in a miasma of uncomprehended scientific certainties, unquote, which for them are as oppressive as any medieval religious dogma. Covert revolt, cargo cults, the ritualization of education, my field, and similar manifestations of unreason must be expected and, may finally bury us. So is unreason needed for ordinary people to survive in an over-complex society? And it's getting more complex by the day. Between astrological charts and, well, let's say economic rationalism, lies a continuum of misreason or unreason that entangles and engages the energies of all but a small part of the world's population. Confusion. Maybe one morning they will wake up, find the digital controls of civilization are on sick leave with a computer virus, and reason from their own confusion that God has finally arrived for a brief annihilation ceremony before catching the 4:30 space drifter to the next universe. Oh dear, I'm being facetious. Let's quickly go on to the next point. The human brain as a prediction machine. This is interesting. If the human brain is a fairly successful prediction machine, both for managing our internal physiology and for surviving in a hostile world, do we really need an external God to guarantee outcomes anyway? I've added another link by some scientists called Brian Greene, David Chalmers, and Anil Seth. And the title to that video is What Creates Consciousness? And that actually ties in with this prediction stuff. So the conclusion reached by these researchers is that for most of the world's population, until recently, an external God or some external agent was needed to guarantee outcomes anticipated by our clever, predictive brains, not least in a world full of threats and, merely fair weather friends you can't rely on. There was a lack of self-confidence. God was a helper and a guarantor. This has been supplanted for many in the age of science by perhaps foolhardy confidence that we can manage stuff on our own. Thanks very much. Not everyone shares that confidence, which seems a pretty strong reason for many to still cling to recognized gods and religions. Feeling a need for an external agency is a different question, of course, from whether that agency actually exists. But if God didn't exist, God or gods would certainly need to have been invented. Okay. Talking point 9. Are the rituals and beliefs of religions still necessary stabilizing forces for large populations? For some people, rituals and beliefs of religion still are a much needed stabilizing force. There are other kinds of rituals, of course. This religious need for ritual and belief is more obvious in societies under stress than in more relaxed environments. Australians, have it pretty good nowadays, though they don't always admit it. For 7 years, I worked in universities in South Korea. And that's a society under huge stress. Drive into any town or city, and especially at night, you'll notice huge pink neon crosses from churches competing for new faithful. South Korea, by the way, also has Buddhism, and it's got traditional spirit beliefs as well, often coexisting, as in China. Every town in China where I worked for 5 years continues to do a brisk trade in temple rituals, lucky amulets, kitchen gods, and so on. Regardless of political parties like the Communist Party. It's never gone away. Of course, the whole religious drill can be overplayed when it intrudes too aggressively on the normal habits of daily life. Religion, at its best, is a vehicle for community. It creates a set of rules and values within which people may direct their thoughts, their behavior, and their plans. It sets the ground rules to feed and breed by. It provides a reason and usually a venue for ritual, for celebration, and most of all, for groups of people from every walk of life to come together for fellowship, for friendship. There are these are the undeniable benefits of religion and the real source of its durability, I think. The trouble is the storylines sustaining those religions, the supernatural storylines, are becoming less and less credible to more and more people. Also, on the debit side of the ledger, social costs, the social costs are becoming too burdensome often to ignore. I've already mentioned Iran. My Iranian friends, I meet a lot of immigrants to Australia. My Iranian friends, fresh from overbearing theocracy, tell me, and I've mentioned this before, I think, that mosque attendance in Iran is beginning to resemble the empty churches of Adelaide. For those of you who are not in Australia, Adelaide is known as the city of churches, but nowadays the city of empty churches. Rituals and beliefs in general, of course, are self-adjusting devices. What they stabilize might be as varied as the self-respect of the individual or the perpetuation of a criminal organization. Perpetuation, that word perpetuation, is actually a major thread. For whatever has some definition in our consciousness will attract an expectation that it might, should, and even must continue. And, you know, eventually that expectation easily becomes ideological and then religious, and maybe gets kicked upstairs to the realm of universal truth. Now, note that some of us, a few of us, seem to be almost predestined outsiders. From the earliest memories, I have been repelled. This is just me personally. I have been repelled by ritual and routinized belief. And this, of course, has put me beyond the ambit of normal community. I've always been an outsider looking in. And I guess there have always been people like me, for better or for worse, a minority. And finally, talking point 10, God as a real psychological helper versus God as a scam. Well, let's tread a little dangerously. When Donald Trump personally sells personally signed gold-covered Bibles made in China for $59.95, we can be pretty sure that the salesman's motive is not a deep religious desire to spread the good word of God. But, you know, at another extreme, there are clearly people, including in Australia, for whom religious faith is a great source of psychological strength and an organizing principle which gives them direction in life. Not all of us might share their passion, but we have to respect it. However, often our judgments are more difficult. Individuals themselves, you know, might not be consistent. They have multiple personalities. They may seem to compartmentalize their beliefs and moral codes in different life spheres, you know, home, work, wherever. For example, and I mentioned this before, Australian politicians, and I guess in most places in the world, Australian politicians as a group have a much higher level of announced religious belief than the general population. No doubt some of them are genuine, at least some of the time, while others may be merely, well, political entrepreneurs. I've linked another video by a well-known medical influencer. We're going commercial here. Dr. Boz. And the Facebook algorithm puts these things in your face. And this happened to come up, so I clicked it. Dr. Boz, her presentation gave me pause, not particularly from a medical perspective. She's very against big pharma and corporate medicine. You know, I'm skeptical of much corporate medical practice too. But I began to wonder a little from her intense story of rejecting orthodox corporate medicine after direct messaging from her God. It's a very American story, and may be entirely genuine. Or it might be a way of banking reputational capital. Her advice in the video comes along with a long list of Dr. Boz products to be purchased. Decide for yourself. This kind of personal decision about the religion of others will, I guess, always be with us. And perhaps I've talked long enough, so see what you can do with those talking points.